Welcome to the Straight Red Card, and as part of our ongoing MLS season preview series, today we have on the show Mr. Steve Clare, who is the founder of ProstAmerica.com and a board member for the North American Soccer Reporters. Steve, thanks for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure, gentlemen.
Absolutely it is. By the way, I wanted to thank you right up front for connecting us with some of the guys in Vancouver and Portland, because they were fabulous guests.
It's a pleasure. They're great fans in both of those cities, great fans of our sport, and really nice gentlemen to be colleagues of.
And we have a kind of interesting season coming up because of those entries into the MLS, but not only because of that, because every new season in the MLS is almost typically for a lot of teams like starting over, but not so much for you guys this season. Can you give us sort of an overview of any of the major things that have happened in the off season and what we need to keep our eyes open for as far as the players go that have either left the club or have joined the club since?
Well, I think if you were to compare Sounders FC to the end of last season, it would be sort of a very small amount of change. If you were to compare to the start of last season, obviously the biggest thing is that Freddie Ljungberg won't be there. But I think most of your readers, being the readers and listeners, being the intelligent people that they are, will probably know much more about the Sounders team that finished the season in Los Angeles.
Yes.
The big news are that they lost Sana Niasi and Nate Sturgis in the draft to Vancouver, who quickly traded them on elsewhere. Blaise Nkufo, the designated player, is still there, but he's now been joined by Freddie Montero and Alvaro Fernandez, who are both become designated players.
Right.
Well, Fernandez probably was already. That is important because these guys are not big stars. They're not aging Europeans. Not that I have anything against aging Europeans. One day I'll be one myself. But because there are guys on the way up, their career, using Major League Soccer, to enhance their careers rather than to end them. And that's an experiment that a lot of folk I've talked to hope becomes the norm in MLS. O'Brien White has arrived from Toronto, and there's high hopes for him. And there's a few youngsters and a few draft picks that there are high hopes for as well.
Now,
I think that's the one thing I liked what Seattle has done is by pushing Montero up to DP status where he wasn't before, but he's been such a quality player for Seattle that he's deemed worthy, and he is still a young player, obviously, and I think that's something that MLS really should look into doing.
More teams, yeah.
I quite agree, and I have to say that I think if that experiment is a success, you'll see it a lot more.
But I think a lot of the other teams, perhaps, if maybe even though Red Bulls has a very high-quality team this season, a lot of teams in the past have maybe brought that big-name player in to increase or boost attendance, where you guys don't really need that. So for you, it's all utilitarian. It's about what that player can bring now and in the future.
I think that's a fair comment, that Sounders FC don't really need a DP to sell tickets, although, of course, there are 30,000 empty seats on the upper bowl, but that's another story. I think it's be fair to say that even in Portland, they so far got to 12,000 without a designated player, and Vancouver have got to 16,500 and only added one last Friday. So there is an appetite for football in this part of the world. But I think in both cases, I know for a fact Hasley just arrived on Friday, and I know Portland are looking for one. I think it would be ideal for all of MLS that we could start to sell tickets not on the basis of a big name, but on the basis of a good team.
Right. And you take, Alvaro Fernandez for an example. I mean, here's a guy who came off the bench a lot last year. Do you see this guy starting this season? I mean, or is he going to continue to be that, the one DP guy that comes off the bench?
I think not the latter, because that will be Blaise Nkufo, who really, bar one game in Columbus where they drilled the crew 4-0, hasn't really turned it on, and he looks especially apathetic on Friday night, albeit in a preseason game. I think Fernandez had the first season blues. He was adapting to the culture of Major League Soccer. And I've gone on the record as not being a big fan so far. He's looked for free kicks too readily in the tackle. and he's expecting things to come his way. This is a physical league, and you have to work a little harder. If your listeners have seen pictures of Fernandez, he's quite a lean guy. He maybe needs to put on a little bit of weight. Certainly comes to the right country to do that.
But
you're going to get emails about that one.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not sold on Fernandez yet, but I do think this about Sounders. If they're to really go that extra mile compared to last season, a lot depends on him making a stellar improvement.
what's the rationale then behind giving him DP money if he didn't really blow things up as I thought and you think, and like maybe we thought he should? Are they basically saying, okay, well, that was a transitional season, this guy's still incredibly skilled, so what's the rationale about giving this guy that kind of money this early on?
In the player's defense, his wife was still in Uruguay and gave birth, and there were a lot of, even added to the fact there's a bit of a cultural difference to coming and playing in Seattle from Uruguay. There was all that he had to deal with and the assimilation, and everybody knows that this is a good player for MLS. He was in a team that ran all the way to the World Cup semi-finals in 2010. So I certainly think now that he's on the books, it's worth it to give him that kind of money to see how he can perform in this league. Because really, if you cast your net around the world, guys who've been in a team that got to World Cup semi-final are not really available for the kind of money he's got. You may have to pay a lot more.
Yeah. Now, one of the additions I did notice for this season is Erik Friberg, or is it Berg, from Sweden. Last played at Haken in Sweden. What kind of addition is this guy, and what do you see him bringing to the club in the midfield?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to name drop here. I asked the very same question to General Manager Adrian Hanauer. I said, does Erik Friberg bring that bit of steel to the Sounders midfield? And Adrian, as his wont, started to answer cerebrally, if I got that right. And then he looks at me and realizes that I'm from Glasgow and says, if you mean is he the sort of guy that will lay out opponents? And I go, aye, that's exactly what I meant. Because my feeling is exactly what Sounders need. They need an enforcer.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the problems with Freddie Ljungberg, that other teams were clocking him, and yet nobody was clocking their skill for players in return. So he's not that kind of player. I've now had a chance to see him play. He dropped that quite deep against Portland, distributed the ball well, but I don't think he's the sort of guy that's going to be reminding the creative fellows on the other team that they are fair game if the creative fellows on the Sounders team are also fair game.
Yeah. Now, what the hell happened with Freddie Ljungberg? He just seemed to turn into a real grumpy guy there at the end. I mean, in the end, what the hell, holy hell, happened with Freddie Ljungberg that made him decide made the team decide he's got to get the hell out of town?
Or perhaps he looked into a crystal ball and saw Chicago. Somewhere in it. No, I kid, of course. Here is, I don't want to take too long to go over old ground, so this is the expurgated version, as they'd say. Freddie Ljungberg never really found a way of playing on the pitch with Freddie Montero. There was always a problem there, in as much as they were basically the same player. They obviously rarely passed to each other. Also, there were dressing room divisions. There were various camps in the Sounders locker room. It is said Freddie was the leader of one of them. There's also other things that he was brought in as a DP, brought in to sell tickets, and many of his players and many fans felt he hadn't really lived up to the money. And bear in mind, as you well know in Major League Soccer, if you've got a DP on a lot of money, there's a guy there who's earning maybe a tenth or even a lower fraction of it. Yeah. I think really when you're on that sort of big money, you have to do something extra both in the locker room and on the pitch. And, of course, the more obvious face of it was his relationship with the referees. Early on in his career, Ziggy Schmidt was coming out post-game and always blaming the referee for anything that went wrong with the Sounders. That went on, and Freddie Ljungberg was doing the same. Then there came a point when even Ziggy had enough of using that excuse in year two. Freddie, however, continued to. Yeah. Then at one point, Ziggy came out and said, well, after one game, the referees didn't cost us this game, and gave a very... Well, you didn't have to really read between the lines. You just needed to not have your head buried in the sand. It was telling Freddie Ljungberg to get on with the game and stop harassing referees. The next game, and I think it was against Chicago, actually enough, you actually heard the camera on the sideline pick up Ziggy shouting at Freddie, "You'll get yourself booked if you don't shut up," or words of that ilk. He didn't shut up. He got himself booked, and the camera then picked up, "I told you so."
Yeah.
But I believe that was the last game before he was traded to Chicago for the sort of buttons that you read about in Cinderella.
Yeah. What about all these, speaking of Ziggy, we're big fans of this guy. I mean, the guy knows his stuff. But after some of the recent preseason losses, there are some, hell, there are a lot of Seattle fans, but some of them came out and they're already calling for his firing. Now, you're a fairly knowledgeable guy. I mean, how do you deal with such maybe simple-minded approach to the firing and hiring of folks?
Oh, I don't think you need to be so diplomatic. I have gone to war. Last year it was Brad Evans. Sounders had an injury crisis and had no forwards, and Brad was being played everywhere on the pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, Brad's not exactly the media's favourite guy because, he's pretty shy, and you can go to Jeff Park, and Jeff Park will give you a quote and be a great laugh. Brad's more withdrawn. But some of the stuff that was on the internet boards about Brad Evans was frankly appalling. The guy was doing his best way out of position.
Yeah.
And when he was missing chances a forward would take, you could see the pain on his face. The guy was trying too hard. Eventually, Ziggy came out, and I actually met Ziggy privately at some other function, and I said, "Look, off the record, I think your defense of Brad is totally correct." And I wish, that the internet, some of the fringes of the internet would leave him alone. Ziggy then came out with this: people who know soccer know what value Brad brings to a team. And I got a lot of flack for defending a player that some thought was indefensible. But Seattle has a very, very solid, hardcore, very, very knowledgeable fans. But when you've got 36,000 in the stadium, you've got at the other end people who are, shall we say, keyboard trigger happy.
Well, what's the internet without irrational opinions?
Well, absolutely. And that's part of the game. My site, as much as I can, supports fan culture. And before I started writing, I was as an irrational fan as anybody on the planet. Some of the things I've sung on the terraces would not bear scrutiny in a truth-telling contest. I might still maintain that Partick Thistle are the greatest football team the world has ever seen, but I wouldn't do it under oath. So I think it's fair to say that there's always people calling for changes. And we've also got this other thing where those who were there at the time of the USL side are butting heads with those who jumped on the bandwagon. And those who have been the older and longer term fans are pretty loyal to their guys, Zach Scott, Taylor Graham, Roger Revec, whereas those guys who just joined in don't see what the fuss is about.
Right.
So there's always that friction there.
Yeah.